provided to you as well. I have more things I'd like to ask than we'll have time for, but we'll just take what we have.
Let's go for it.
So thanks for being willing to.
Happy to do it, believe me, because it's nice to be in the presence of other people who are concerned about where we're heading and appreciative of the value of reflecting on this wonderful tension that we have in this country between being individuals and being individuals who together comprise a community. And I think there's been a valuing and a prizing of individualism in ways that have led us to lose track of some of the importance of how our actions actually contribute to how they might land for other people in ways that are not what we would have intended, but can sometimes perpetuate a cycle that leaves people feeling unheard or victimized or as if they are not able to receive the benefits that others are receiving. And I think that's dangerous and bad for our country. And we need to find ways to talk together, recognizing that what's true for you doesn't endanger me or threaten me. It can be what's true for you, and I have my own experience, and the value of the work that we do, I think, lies in the opportunity to learn more about each other's experience and to really begin to try to find ways to have a richer, more complex understanding of who we are as a country, who we are as a people, and how we want to be together as well. I awoke one day, I heard that Rabin had been assassinated, and I confess that my first thought was along the lines of, I can't believe the Palestinians did this, or I wonder where this person was from, Egypt or Jordan or whatever. And when I found out that he was not assassinated by an Arab, by a Muslim, by a Palestinian, but rather by a Jewish Israeli, it shook me to my foundation, because I had always grown up understanding that 2 Jews, 3 temples, the idea that debate, that differences were something that were inherent in my faith tradition, that were cherished, that were celebrated, but were not grounds for killing one another. And it was a terrible shock to imagine that this man, in fact, was assassinated because he was proposing a path to peace with Palestinians. And when I learned more about the situation in Israel, in fact, prior to his assassination, it only became more disturbing. Images of him with a Hitler mustache, images of him made up as a Nazi, because he was seen by some as betraying the Jewish people by virtue of his interest in trying to build peace. And it made me feel like we really need to find ways to engage with one another, to bring our differences together, to hear each other, so that each of us can have the experience of feeling deeply listened to and heard by those with whom, in the famous joke, there's a Jewish fellow who's shipwrecked, and finally, after years, he sees a ship on the horizon and starts to pull in, and he's on an island, and finally the ship is coming to rescue him. And the fellow who takes off from the ship in a little boat comes to shore, says, "We're here to take you back to civilization." He says, "Great, but first let me show you a couple things." And he takes him and he shows him two buildings, and he explains, in answer to the question, "What is this?" He says, "Well, that's my shul, my temple." And the captain says, "And what's the other one over there that looks almost the same?" And he said, "Oh, that's the shul I wouldn't be caught dead in." And that's the way in which Jews have behaved toward one another. We have our opinions, we have our differences, but the idea that the differences would result in death was so abhorrent and so upsetting, and it really left me feeling like we've got to find ways to connect with one another and be heard. The other story that occurred about 10 months before that was much more local, and that was in Boston. A man named John Salvi, who styled himself as a pro-life individual, went into 2 women's health clinics and shot and killed several people and wounded a number of others. And in the wake of that, the governor and the cardinal both called for a different kind of conversation than the one that was currently taking place, and isn't so different from today, where one side accuses the other of hating women and wanting to deprive women of basic rights, and the other side says, "But you folks are baby killers." And in the wake of the calls from the governor and the cardinal for a different kind of conversation, the Public Conversations Project recruited a number of volunteer facilitators to sit down with pro-life and pro-choice individuals and to have conversations for the purpose of learning and understanding, and not for persuasion or convincing the other. And I heard the kinds of things that inspired me and gave me hope. Like a woman who said, "I'm a feminist. I will be until the day I die, and I expect to be for all eternity. And I'm deeply troubled by the fact that every year there are hundreds of thousands of deaths of abortions that occur in the world for the purpose of the destruction of female fetuses. It doesn't change my overall opinion that women should have the right to control their own bodies, but it is distressing." And I heard someone say that she was an activist and an organizer, but there was one issue that she didn't discuss even with her friends, and that was the issue of abortion. Because she was convinced that within 10 or 20 years, the gay gene would be discovered, and there would be a genocide, and there would be no more GLBTQ people. If it were possible to prevent the birth of a gay fetus. And so she said, "So I'm pro-life," which might seem inconsistent with many of my other beliefs, but actually I think is really quite consistent. So when I heard those two courageous and amazing women tell those stories, I became convinced that there is a better way. There's a way to bring people together that's not for the purpose of compromising their deeply held values. It's not for seeking common ground. It's for expressing what's really important to you and being willing to be courageous enough to not only express that, but to also listen to something that might be very different from another person. And it convinced me that this is what we need a lot more of in the world. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to do this kind of work for the past almost 20 years in the US, in Canada, in Greece around immigration, in Burundi and Liberia after civil conflicts, Liberia after a 14-year civil war, and in Nigeria over a period of years where sporadic inter-religious violence has caused tens of thousands of deaths. And I feel incredibly privileged to be able to work with people who are similarly committed and similarly inspired and inspiring in wanting to find ways to build bridges. So.
No, let's stay with that, and I'll go to the next one. You can just say whatever comes up, and I have plenty of questions.
Okay.
So you don't have to...
Yeah. There's a difference between being in the presence of someone else and speaking what what I feel passionately about, and being in the presence of someone else who is listening deeply, with curiosity, with interest, who might ask questions to better understand, but who's listening for the purpose of understanding, as opposed to listening for the purpose of debating or being right, or listening to respond. And no, I don't think that kind of listening takes place a lot. Certainly, media doesn't promote it. I'm still a political junkie. I still flip the TV on in the evening to hear people responding to what's going on. But what people are often doing is listening, preparing to speak, rather than listening to understand the other person or listening for the purpose of learning anything. And I think that's one of the gifts that dialogue has to offer, is the opportunity to be listened to and to be really heard by someone who is genuinely curious and interested in understanding better what my experience is as I am of theirs.
Beautiful. So I'm listening to your answer. I'm out in the audience, and I'm saying, okay, I like that, Dave. How can I listen to someone who's hurting our country so much, who believes things that are hurting the planet, or who believes things that are taking away my guns, or who believe things that are... I feel so much anger. I feel so much fear. Talk to those fears and that anger. Is dialogue a place where that can be brought up? I mean, are you asking me to lay all that aside and just pretend like everything is good, or can I bring that into dialogue?
I was listening to a podcast this morning on my way out here. I'm not going to remember who it was, but it was a political observer talking about how wonderfully powerful fear and anger are. what great motivators they are. And they are. And I guess what I would hope is that we can find ways to sit down together, to talk about what we value, what we think is really important, what we deeply care about, to talk about what we hope for in terms of what kind of world we want our children and our grandchildren to grow up in, and to talk about what we fear. And my belief is that if we can create the kind of spaces that can invite those kinds of conversations, we'll end up walking out of the room with a deeper understanding of each other, of what matters to each other, and probably recognize some common concerns, even as we have a much clearer understanding of what each of us might also fear or be worried about or concerned about. But right now there are so many assumptions that go unchallenged. It's so easy to say, I know that you're a Mormon, and therefore I can also make these 5 or 6 other assumptions about you. Or, I know you're a professor, or I know you're a guy or a woman, or someone of a particular kind of profession, or of certain family status, and to not even be conscious of what some of those assumptions might be. So I think what dialogue can offer is the opportunity to come together and learn from each other and with each other, and to really be able to start to ask ourselves, why do I believe that? Where does that come from? What do I know about this person? What assumptions might I be making, and what assumptions or stereotypes might they be entertaining about me? But it starts with the willingness to, I think, look at oneself and to have the courage to be able to stand up and certainly to speak what's true for you, as well as to listen with enough resilience to be able to hear what might be true for someone else.
What do you mean, listen with resilience? Talk about that.
Listening with resilience goes back to the idea of listening with the intention of trying to understand, so that when I hear something that makes me want to respond like, no, you're wrong about that, to kind of hold that for a moment, what might feel like a natural response, and to approach difference with curiosity, to approach it with a willingness to ask about someone else's experience. What is it that led you to that? Can you tell me about some of the values that underlie that? Is there something from your life experience that has shaped your beliefs that are so different from mine? So I think that's what listening with resilience is. It's that willingness to kind of not judge others, because I think many of us make judgments all the time, but to suspend judgment temporarily and to ask questions. Well, one of the biggest challenges that I think arises now in particular is the fact that we increasingly are self-segregating or clustering in a variety of ways, one of which is geographic. It's increasingly the case that we're living among those who see the world as we do. In the 1976 presidential election between Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, about 23% of all counties, so we're not talking congressional districts, which can be gerrymandered, but counties, 23% of all counties were landslide counties, 55-45, one way or the other. By 2016, you may remember watching those election maps, and it's astounding how there are just more and more concentrations of blue and red in ways that are not kind of Jackson Pollock, throw the paint on the map, but are solid kind of geographic areas. So I think it was something like 90-something% of all counties in the most recent election, 40 years later, that were landslide counties, one way or the other. And I think that's one of the challenges. The fact, certainly, that the media now is actually, people are talking about it as a big change from the time of Walter Cronkite, is the way it's usually framed, and the CBS, ABC, NBC, 3 networks, there were objective facts and so on. But actually, if you go back through American history, it was not at all uncommon that media was politicized, and that there were conservative papers and liberal papers, and I think we seem to be returning to that. One of the challenges of that is, I think, trying to figure out how can we arrive at a common set of facts. Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said 35 years ago, everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own facts. And increasingly, that presents a real challenge for us, because depending on what the source is, we come up with different facts, and we've got to find a much better way of being able to deal with facts, and to understand what facts are and what is news and what is fake news. To me, one of the most troubling things right now is the idea that there is an assault here, but not just in the U.S., but that some of these same social factors that I've been talking about are true in Western Europe as well. And that increasingly there's this assault on truth, assault on objective facts. And to the extent that the Russians may have been, for example, contributing to this, we need to look in the mirror. We need to take responsibility for ourselves in terms of doing a better job of monitoring and thinking more deeply about what's the source for this. Can I trust this? Is this in fact a fact? And I think other countries who are interested in sowing division find the soil very ripe, because we're all too ready to jump and to leap into that polarized place. And I think that we need to take some responsibility for looking at how can we engage together as citizens and in our communities in ways that strengthen and build our community rather than tear it apart. Well, one thing that I would say is that part of what is a frequent experience of people participating in a dialogue is that they approach it expecting that they're going to learn something about somebody else's beliefs, somebody whose ideas differ dramatically, perhaps, from theirs. But I've often had the experience of people saying afterwards, I had no idea that I was going to reflect as deeply as I have on my own beliefs, that some of the questions here really got me thinking about how it comes to be that this is so important to be, or how it comes to be that I actually have this internal kind of tension around the issues that we're discussing today. Because usually if I'm with someone that I disagree with, I end up defending my side and they end up defending their side. And it's almost like you could start the tape recorder, both of you could walk away for 45 minutes, come back in the room, and you probably could have told exactly what would have been going on the tape recorder. Because we get into slogans and simplification and binary thinking where it's really somebody's right and somebody's wrong. And it's wonderful to hear people talk about the way in which dialogue can help them to reflect more deeply. When I first went to Nigeria to begin 3 years of work there, with our partners, a number of very inspiring, courageous Christians and Muslims who were part of the Interfaith Mediation Center, working to build coexistence and community. The very first thing that I did was to have them do a dialogic introduction. Now these are people, there was one person for whom it was her first day on the job, but of the 20 people in the group, many of the others had worked together for 3, 5, 10, or even 20 years. So they knew each other. So why did I have them do introductions to begin the workshop? I asked them to do an introduction by talking about what their spiritual teachings said to them about that influenced them to devote their lives to this kind of peace building. And I asked them to tell a story about someone who had inspired them, someone from their faith tradition. And at the end of that, after they had shared stories, several of them said, I can't believe that we have worked together for 20 years, but I've never heard you talk about that. I've never understood that that's what brought you to this work. So a large part of what we're hoping to invite in dialogue is people talking about their passion, people talking about what inspired them, people talking about why they feel drawn to a particular worldview, to certain beliefs, and inviting them to have a conversation that surfaces fresh, new information, which is what the people at IMC experienced, and allowed them to reconnect in a different way than coming to work every day and shaking hands and saying hello, which is what they typically do.
Thank you. Fresh information that changes how we might see someone else.
So I'm thinking about that because a lot of the work that I've done here more recently is in the wake of this kind of increasing political division that we're experiencing. And actually, let me reflect back to a different piece of work, which isn't about the politics that's going on right now, but it's about some work that I did within a faith community over a period of a couple summers. And this was a residential faith community where people came to worship together, to study together, to spend summers together, learning, enjoying cultural and religious experiences. And over time, there began to be deep rifts between those who referred to themselves as heritagists or traditionalists, and those who saw themselves as more inclusionist. And people began behaving towards each other in ways that were not representative of the finest teachings of their faith tradition. And one evening, two amazing women sat down on the porch of one of them at their cottage, and these two, one heritagist and one inclusionist, could not have disagreed more on the issue that was facing their community at the time about what constituted membership, what requirements ought to be in place to be able to be a leaseholder in their community. They knew that they saw this 180 degrees different. But what one of them said when she walked over to her neighbor's house was, both of us love our community, and we both recognize the damage that's being done to our social fabric. We know that relationships have been cut off. We know that people aren't talking to each other. We know that people are demonizing each other and stereotyping each other, and that people are behaving in ways that don't embody the best of our tradition, which has gone on for 140 years. And we think there's got to be a way for us to sit down and begin to learn who the other is, not who we think they are, but to hear it firsthand from them. And these two women contacted us, and I went out there and had the opportunity to meet with them and train about 20 other members to become dialogue facilitators. And during that first summer, they had something like 25 small group cottage dialogues where people came together and heard each other's stories and heard what was true directly from the mouths of those with whom they disagreed. And they willingly sat and listened and asked questions and attempted to understand each other. And what happened was it inspired hope, and it enabled people to reconnect and to be able to reknit the fabric of community. So I think that would be an example.
Beautiful.
That in my work in Liberia after the Civil War there, where those who thought were very heavily stigmatized, and nobody was in a real hurry to reintegrate them back into the community because these were people who had committed atrocities. And a number of them had gotten together in a group called the National Ex-Combatants Peacebuilding Initiative, which was a remarkable organization composed of men and women who had fought and who recognized the harm that they had caused and wanted to atone for that, and actively set out to try to rebuild community and to try to, by their actions, exhibit a different kind of leadership. And what came up there often was the same kind of issue that has come up here in some of the work that we did with Welcoming America around immigration issues. And that was just this fascinating question of who are we, who is our community, and who gets to define that? Because I think that community is a very powerful source, potentially, of support and nurturance and guidance for us, and can also be a source of exclusion and of bad treatment of those whom we deem not to be part of our community. So I guess that sense of how do we define community and who does that is a question that comes up for me a lot in thinking about some of our work, where it can be very easy to entertain stereotypes. There's frankly no faster way of pulling together a community than by othering the other, by deeming some people outside the bounds of our community. So I guess that's something that I think about at times and want to try to make sure that there are opportunities for really thinking about the implications of defining ourselves. So it's a question that I continue to wrestle with. That's quite a question. I think part of what I would say is probably that we as a country, we as a people, we as a society are going to be a lot better off when we have the benefit of hearing each other's voices. There's a wonderful line that I was taught by a Nigerian friend from the Quran that says, surely if God had wanted to create us all the same, he could have done so. We're not created all the same. There's lots of reason and research that supports the idea that the ways in which conservatives and liberals process information, take in information, is actually different. It's not just our values that are different, although they are often differently weighted even when we share the same values. But if we can have the opportunity and demand better of ourselves, if we can bring ourselves into relationship with others around our differences and recognize that by exploring those differences, just like with our children or our grandchildren, when we're putting together a jigsaw puzzle, you may have your pieces, I have my pieces. When we share our pieces, we stand a better chance of understanding what the big picture actually looks like. And I think today that different groups feel like, I've got my pieces, I know what it looks like, and I'm right and you're wrong, and we need to be doing what I see and believe. And I guess what I would say is that hold out the possibility that there may be some value in seeing the other person's pieces, in hearing their story, and recognizing that we were not all created the same, that we have grown up in the same country, but in different families, in different communities, with from different ethnicities, races, religions, of different genders, of different experiences, such that we have an enormous wealth to share with each other if only we can slow down and have the courage to truly engage with one another with curiosity and move from certainty to uncertainty, or to openness to the other, that we have an awful lot to benefit from if we can do that.
Oh man, I wish I caught that laughter just now. I love your laugh.
So what are we doing?
You told me once that you were concerned the lack of dialogue. Dialogue is kind of a safety valve, and the lack of it could contribute to violence. Do you still believe that? I mean, do you believe that this is a life and death issue?
I believe that if we don't do a better job of engaging with one another, that potentially this could be something that could be really damaging to American society. We began by talking about a couple things: the assassination of Rabin and the shootings by John Salvi. And what I think dialogue can do is dialogue can be the pressure relief valve. I think that what happens in times of polarization is that the zealots get empowered. The voices that get heard are the voices that are more extreme. That when we flip on the TV and we see people screaming at one another or talking over one another, lots of talking and no listening, they're on TV. They're set up in that way to produce something that we consume, that sells commercial products. And people who are more complex, people whose views are nuanced, people whose approach is more thoughtful, are not going to be the ones who are invited on those shows, because they're just not as entertaining as people who are yelling at one another and calling each other names. And I think what dialogue can do is make space for the people who are between here and here as well, the people whose ideas are deeply felt, but not expressed in ways that dehumanize or demonize others. And I think that describes most Americans, even though there are powerful forces that encourage us to demonize, to stereotype. I spoke with Grover Norquist 10 years ago at the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation, where he was a panelist on a panel that I had convened. And we talked beforehand, and he said to me something about how with just 2 words he could raise hundreds of thousands of dollars overnight. And this was early 2008, and those 2 words were Hillary Clinton. And there's tons of research that supports the idea that the easiest way to form us is to define them, because all of us stand in opposition to them. And I think that that kind of advocacy is one that doesn't pay attention to the cost of conflict. And the cost to our society is becoming increasingly clear, and it's becoming something that conflict entrepreneurs, whether Americans, Russians, or others, take advantage of because it sells, it works for them. We're challenged to be our better selves, to be the kind of people that can help to heal a broken country, a country that has enormous potential if only we can make it so.
Last question. This is kind of maybe a surprising question. My generation and kids younger than me, we've kind of stopped listening to our elders. We got Google. We got science. We know it already, sort of. And I think that's a little sad. I want to ask you, as one of my elders who I've respected and loved, share something from your years that is on your heart to share to younger folks like me. I wish we would listen to you. I wish we were more. And I had a wonderful grandfather that was just everything to me. So I want to ask the grandfather question. You've got grandkids. Talk to us from your years and your wisdom, and share a little bit of what you would just share in this moment. There's much you could share, and it's just going to be a sliver of advice, reflection.
So I've been asked this kind of question before, and I find it enormously challenging because I don't see myself as having all that much. I'm not sure how to answer the question. I guess what I would say is there are certainly people that come to mind for me who've inspired me, who've set me on this path. And I'm at a place in my life now where I continue to teach, I continue to practice, and find it enormously gratifying when I'm working with people from a younger generation, which is pretty often, given that I'll turn 70 this year. To think that when I'm no longer doing this in 5 years or 10 years or whatever, that there will be people who will be carrying on. So all I can say is, I guess, that I've been fortunate enough to have been passed along some important values and beliefs that have helped motivate me to do what I've done. And I hope that I've had the opportunity, well, not I hope I've had the opportunity, I hope I've been successful in communicating some of those to others who will be doing this work when I'm no longer doing it.
Thank you. Anything else you'd like to share for now?
No, just to say thank you for this opportunity. I'm assuming that there'll be a way that I could get a copy of this, because there are people with whom I'd like to share it.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be really meaningful to me.